Okay. I think I will mute the Pokemon bot. Look at me now. It's just a tragic state. I'll switch to the chatting window now. Because I'm so... I had myself muted. I need to fix something. Don't ask me why that song is in my mind, because it just is. Tales from the Crypt. Okay. So, anyway, we're going to be... Oh, nice of you to join us, Stream Elements. Only took you a minute and a half before you posted that I was on. Not surprised. I have sound alerts and whatnot turned off in my regular ones, so... Still cutting off. I do not know what's going on with that. That is annoying as hell. Oh well. I'm listening to Sophia and work right now. Because I lurk in a lot of people's streams. You don't see me because I'm just that kind of lurker. Anyway. Why do I have weird songs going through my head right now? I'm going to time out Pokemon. Just because... Sit. Didn't even let me sit. How much? Time for an hour. Okay. Not that I don't try to catch my own Pokemon when I'm in here, but I can't catch it and read at the same time. I love the fact that... Anyway. Oh, it's just showing the module of it now. Ouch. That is odd. I did not know it did that. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. Let's see. Do this. Oh, that's just hilarious. Sophia's reading Road to Oz right now. So, if you don't know, I'm doing the Oz books off stream because I had a request for it. She's got her 300th follower. Okay. Okay. Let's see. 9:07, so it's not quite time for me to get started yet. And I do have the wonderful deerstalker hat on because we are doing Sherlock Holmes, and it is the traditional hat that Holmes is often seen wearing, along with his often worn tweed jacket. But she just got 300 followers, so that's kind of cool. I'm at how many? I'm at 220. But judging by the goal, I have 2 active subs right now. So, yeah. Anyway, we are going to be doing Sherlock Holmes tonight. The first story is going to be a case of identity. So, prepare yourselves. We still have 2 more minutes before I will begin. So, if you want to get your drinks or whatever, you can go ahead and do that now before I get started. And we can rock out a little. That would involve me having music, which I still haven't figured out what music I want to use yet. As I've been given options for different musics, I just, really haven't gone to listen to any of them yet. I really should because I want, background music and such. I mean, I've just got the fireplace going in the background of my readings, but I can't figure out what kind of theme music I would have. I mean, what goes with me? I never really thought about, music among the other things that I was doing when I got started. Let me adjust something real quick because I'm taller. There we go. But, I'm just here and, chilling out and whatnot. Such a nonsense. Wait, I can leave I don't want to leave the alerts on and then have them muted because that would just seem tacky. Oh well, we are at 9:10. We started a minute late. My apologies for that. And we haven't quite made it to the 10 minutes being live yet, but hey, it is what it is, what it is, what it is. Let me make sure that my audio is going. It is not. Okay. I can hear it, can you? Okay. But anyway. Now that it is after 9:10, I believe it is roughly time for us to begin our story. I just like doing the Holmes voice, honestly. Not as much as the Watson voice. The Watson voice is rather dignified and paternal, I would suppose. As opposed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who is a bit more prim and proper in his diction, and yes, quite so. Anyway, our first story for this evening would be A Case of Identity. I will try to look more at the camera because it kind of bothers people that my eyes are closed half the time. Anyway, A Case of Identity. "My dear fellow," said Sherlock Holmes as we sat on either side of the fire in his lodgings at Baker Street, "life is infinitely stranger than anything which mind of man can invent. We would not dare to conceive the things which are really mere commonplace of existence. If we could fly out of the window hand in hand, hover over the great city, gently remove the roofs, and peep in at the queer things which are going on, the strange coincidences, the plannings, the cross-purposes, the wonderful chain of events, working through generations and leading to the most outré results, it would make all fiction with its conventionalities and foreseen conclusions most stale and unprofitable. And yet I am convinced of it," I answered. "The cases in which comes to light in the papers are, as a rule, bold enough and vulgar enough. We have in our police reports realism pushed to its extreme limits, and yet the real result of it is, I must be confessed, a GameCube. Neither fascinating nor artistic." Hi, Sam. Yeah, my sound alerts aren't working still. I don't know what's going on. "A certain selection and discretion must be used in production of a realistic effect," remarked Holmes. "This is wanting in a police report, where more stress is laid, perhaps, upon the platitudes of the magistrate than upon the details, which, to an observer, contain the vital essence of the whole matter. Depend upon it, there is nothing so unnatural as the commonplace." I smiled and shook my head. "I can quite understand your thinking so," I said. "Of course, in your position as unofficial adviser and helper to everybody in the absolutely puzzled throughout 3 continents, you are brought in contact with all that is strange and bizarre. But here," I picked up the morning paper with the ground, "let us put it to a practical test. Here is the first heading upon which I come. A husband's cruelty to his wife. There is half a column of print, but I know without reading it that it is perfectly familiar to me. There is, of course, the other woman, the drink, the push, the blow, the bruise, the sympathetic sister or landlady. The crudest of writers could invent nothing more crude." "Indeed, your example is an unfortunate one for your argument," said Holmes, taking the paper and glancing his eye down it. "This is the Dundas separation case, and it happens I was engaged in clearing up some small points of connection with it. The husband was a teetotaler. There was no other woman, and the conduct winding up every meal by taking out his false teeth and hurling them at his wife. Which, you will allow, is not an action likely to occur in the imagination of the average storyteller. Take a pinch of snuff, Doctor, and acknowledge that I have scored over you in your example." He held out his snuff-box of old gold with a great amethyst in the center of the lid. Its splendor was in such contrast to his homely ways and his simple life that I could not help commenting upon it. "Ah," said he, "I forgot that I had not seen you for some weeks. It is a little souvenir from the King of Bohemia in return for my assistance in the case of the Irene Adler papers. And the ring? I asked, glancing at the remarkable brilliant which sparkled upon his finger. It was from the reigning family of Holland, though the matter in which I served them was such a delicate that I cannot confide it even in you, who have been good enough to chronicle one or two of my little problems. And have you any on hand just now? I asked with interest. Some 10 or 12, but none which present an interest in the future. They are important, you understand, without being interesting. Indeed, I have found that it is usually in unimportant matters that there is a field of observation, and for the quick analysis of cause and effect which give a charm to an investigation. The larger crimes are apt to be simpler, for the bigger the crime, the more obvious, as a rule, is the motive. All these cases, save for one rather intricate matter which has been referred to me by Massaro, there is nothing which presents any features of interest. It is possible, however, that I may have something better before very many minutes are over, for this is one of my clients, or I am much mistaken. He had risen from his chair and was standing between the parted blinds, gazing down to the dull, neutral-tinted London street. Looking over his shoulder, I saw that on the pavement opposite there stood a large woman, with a heavy fur boa around her neck, and a large curling red feather in a broad-brimmed hat, which was tilted in a coquettish Duchess of Devonshire fashion over her ear. From under this great panoply, she peeped up in a nervous, hesitating fashion at our windows, while her body oscillated backward and forward, and her fingers fidgeted with her glove buttons. Suddenly, with a plunge, as if a swimmer who leaves the bank, she hurried across the road, and we heard the sharp clang of the bell. "I've seen these symptoms before," said Holmes, throwing his cigarette into the fire. "Oscillation upon pavement always means an affaire de cavalier. She would like advice, but is not sure that the matter is not too delicate for communication. And yet, even here we may discriminate. When a woman has been seriously wronged by a man she no longer oscillates, and the usual symptom is broken bell wire. Here we may take it that there is a love matter, but that the maiden is not so much angry as perplexed or grieved. But here she comes in person to resolve our doubts." As he spoke, there was a tap at the door, and the boy in buttons entered to announce Miss Mary Sutherland, while the lady herself loomed behind a small black figure like a full-sailed merchantman behind a tiny pilot boat. Sherlock Holmes welcomed her with easy courtesy for which he was remarkable, and having closed the door and bowed her into an armchair, he looked her over in the minute and yet abstracted fashion which was very particular to him. "Do you not find," he said, "that with your short sight it is a little trying to do so much typewriting?" "I did at first," she answered, "but now I know where the letters are without looking." Then, suddenly realizing the full purport of his words, she gave a violent start and looked up, with fear and astonishment upon her broad, good-humoured face. "You've heard about me, Mr. Holmes?" she cried. "How else could you know all that?" "Never mind," said Holmes, laughing. "It is my business to know things. Perhaps I have trained myself to see what others overlook. If not, why should you come to consult me?" "I came to you, sir, because I heard of you from Mrs. Etheridge, whose husband you found so easy with the police, and everyone had given up him for dead. Oh, Mr. Holmes, I wish you would do so much for me. I'm not rich, but I still have 100 a year in my own right, besides the little that I make in the machine. I would give it all to you now to know what has become of Mr. Handsome Angel." "Why did you come away to consult me in such a hurry?" asked Sherlock Holmes, with his fingertips together and his eyes to the ceiling. Again, a startled look came over the somewhat vacuous face of Miss Mary Sutherland. "Yes, I did bang out of the house," she said, "for it made me angry to see the easy way in which Mr. Woodbank, that is, my father, took it all. He would not go to the police, and he would not go to you, so at last he would do nothing and kept on saying that there was no harm done. It made me mad, and I just on with my things and came right away to you." "Your father," said Holmes. "Your stepfather, surely, since the name is different." "Yes, my stepfather. I call him father, though it sounds funny, too, for he is only 5 years and 2 months older than myself." Mom gets around. "And your mother is alive?" "Oh, yes, my mother is alive and well. I wasn't best pleased, Mr. Holmes, when she married again so soon after father's death, and a man who was nearly 15 years younger than herself. Father was a plumber in the Tottenham Court Road, and he left a tidy business behind him, which mother carried on with Mr. Hardy, the foreman. But when Mr. Winterback came, he made her sell the business, for he was very superior, being a traveller in wines. They got £4700 for the goodwill and interest, which wasn't near as much as father could have got it if he had been alive." "I had expected to see Sherlock Holmes impatient under this rambling and inconsequential narrative, but on the contrary, he had listened with great concentration of attention. "And your own little income," he asked. "Does it come out of the business?" "Oh, no, sir. It is quite separate and is left me by my Uncle Ned in Auckland. It is in New Zealand stock, paying 4.5%. £2,500 was the amount, and I can only touch the interest." "You interest me extremely," said Holmes, "and since you draw so large a sum as 100 a year, with what you earn into the bargain, you no doubt travel a little and indulge yourself in every way. I believe that a single lady can get on very nicely upon an income of about £60. "I could do with much less than that, Mr. Holmes, but you understand that as long as I live at home, I don't wish to be a burden on them, and so they have the use of the money while I am staying with them. Of course, that is only just for the time. Mr. Winterbank draws my interest every quarter and pays it over to mother, and I find that I can do pretty well with what I earn at typewriting. It brings me 2 pence a sheet, and I can often do 15 to 20 sheets in a day." "Not a bad typist." "You have made your position very clear to me," said Holmes. "This is my friend, Dr. Watson, before whom you can speak as freely as before myself. Kindly tell us all you know about your connection with Mr. Hosmer Angel." A flush stole over Miss Sutherland's face, and she picked nervously at the fringe of her jacket. "I met him first at the gasfitters' ball," she said. "They used to send father tickets when he was alive, and then afterwards they remembered us and they sent them to my mother. Mr. Winterbank did not wish us to go. He never did wish us to go anywhere. He would get quite mad if I wanted so much as to join a Sunday school treat. But this time I was set on going, and I would go, for what right had he to prevent? He said the folk were not fit for us to know, when all father's friends were there to be there. And he said that I had nothing fit to wear, when I had my purple plush that I had never so much as taken out of the drawer. At last, when nothing else would do, he went off to France upon the business of the firm, but we went to mother, and I, with Mr. Hardy, who used to be the foreman, and it was there I met Mr. Hosmer Angel." "I suppose," said Holmes, "that when Mr. Winterbank came back from France, he was very annoyed with you having gone to the ball." "Oh, well, he was very good about it.
He laughed, I remember, and shrugged his shoulders, and said there was no use denying anything to a woman, for she would have her way.
True. I see. Then at the gasfitter's ball you met, as I understand, a gentleman called Mr. Hosmer Angel.
Yes, sir. I met him that night, and he called next day to ask if we had gone home all safe. And after that we met him. That was to say, Mr. Holmes, I met him twice for walks. But after that father came back again, and Mr. Hosmer Angel could not come to my house any more.
No?
Oh, you know, father didn't like anything of the sort. He wouldn't have any visitors if he could help it, and he used to say that a woman should be happy in her own family circle. But then, as I used to say to mother, a woman wants her own circle to begin with, and I had not got mine yet.
But how about Mr. Hosmer Angel? Did he make no attempt to see you?
Well, father was going off to France again in a week, and Hosmer wrote and said that it would be safer and better not to see each other until he had gone. We could write in the meantime, and he used to write every day. I took the letters in the morning, and there was no need for father to know.
Were you engaged to the gentleman at this time?
Oh, yes, Mr. Holmes. We were engaged after the first walk we took. Hosmer, Mr. Angel, was a cashier in the office of Leadenhall Street, and...
What office?
That's the worst of it, Mr. Holmes. I don't know.
Where did he live, then?
He slept on the premises.
And you don't know his address?
No, except that it was on Leadenhall Street.
Where did you address the letters, then?
To the Leadenhall Street post office, to be left till called for. He said that if they were sent to the office he would be chaffed by all the other clerks for having letters from a lady. So I offered to typewrite them, like he did his. But he wouldn't have that, for he said that when I wrote them, they seemed to come from me. But when they were typewritten, he always felt that the machine had come between us. That will just show how fond of me he was, Mr. Holmes, and little things like that he would think of.
That is most suggestive, said Holmes. It has long been an axiom of mine that the little things are infinitely most important. Can you remember any other little things about Mr. Hosmer Angel?
He was a very shy man, Mr. Holmes. He would rather walk with me in the evening than in the daylight, for he said that he hated to be conspicuous. Very retiring and gentlemanly he was. Even his voice was gentle. He'd had the quinsy and swollen glands when he was young, he told me, and it had left him with a weak throat, and a hesitating, whispering fashion of speech. He was always well dressed, very neat and plain, but his eyes were weak, just as mine are, and he wore tinted glasses against the glare.
Well, and what happened with Mr. Windibank, your stepfather, when he returned to France?
Mr. Hosmer Angel came to the house again, and proposed that we should marry before father came back. He was in dreadful earnest, and made me swear, with my hands on the testament, that whatever happened I would always be true to him. Mother said he was quite right to make me swear, and that it was a sign of his passion. Mother was all in favor from the first, and was even fonder of him than I was. Then, when they talked of marrying within a week, I began to ask about father. But they both said never to mind about father, but just to tell him afterwards, and mother said he would make it all right with him. I didn't quite like that, Mr. Holmes. It seemed funny that I should ask his leave, as he was only a few years older than me. But I didn't want to do anything on the sly, so I wrote to father at Bordeaux, where the company has its French head offices. But the letter came back to me on the very morning of the wedding.
It missed him, then?
Yes, sir, for we had started to England just before it arrived.
Ha! That was unfortunate. Your wedding was arranged then for a Friday. Was it to be in church?
Yes, sir, but very quietly. It was to be at St. Saviour's at King's Cross, and we were to have breakfast afterwards at St. Pancras Inn Hotel. Hosmer came for us in a hansom, but there were two of us. He put us both into it and stepped himself into a four-wheeler, which happened to be only the other cab on the street. We got to the church first, and when the four-wheeler drove up, we waited for him to step out. But he never did. And when the cabman got down from the box and looked, there was no one there. The cabman said that he could not imagine what had become of him, for he had seen him get in with his own eyes. That was last Friday, Mr. Holmes, and I have never seen or heard anything since then throw any light upon what became of him.
It seems to me that you have been very shamefully treated, said Holmes.
Oh, no, sir. He was too good and kind to leave me so. Why, all the morning he was saying that to me. Whatever happened, I was to be true, and that even if something quite unforeseen occurred to separate us, I was to always remember that I was pledged to him, and that he would claim his pledge sooner or later. It seems strange talk for a wedding morning, but what has happened since gives meaning to it.
Most certainly does. Your opinion is, then, that some unforeseen catastrophe has occurred to him?
Yes, sir, it certainly does. I believe that he foresaw some danger, or else he would not have talked so. And then I think that he foresaw what happened.
But you have no notion as to what it could have been?
None.
One more question. How did your mother take to the matter?
She was angry, and said that I was never to speak of the matter again.
And your father? Did he tell you? Did you tell him?
Yes, he seemed to think with me that something had happened, and that I should hear from Hosmer again. As he said, what interest could anyone have in bringing me to the doors of the church and then leaving me? Now, if he had borrowed my money, or if he had married me and got my money settled on him, that might be some reason. But Hosmer was very independent about money, and would never look a showing of mine. And yet, what could have happened? And why could he not write? Oh, it drives me half mad to think of it, and I can't sleep a wink at night.
She pulled on a little handkerchief out of her muff and began to sob heavily into it. I shall glance into the case for you, said Holmes, rising, and I have no doubt that we shall reach soon a definite result. Let the weight of the matter rest upon me now, and do not let your mind dwell upon it further. Above all, try to let Mr. Hosmer Angel vanish from your memory, as he has done from your life.
Then you don't think I'll see him again?
I fear not.
Then what has happened to him?
You will leave that question in my hands. I should like an accurate description of him and any letters of his which you can spare.
I advertised for him in last Saturday's Chronicle, said she. Here's the slip, and here are 4 letters from him.
Thank you. And your address?
Number 31 Lion Place, Camberwell.
Mr. Angel's address you never had, I understand. Where is your father's place of business?
Mr. Angel's address... Oh, he travels from Westhouse to Marbank, great claret importers of Finchford Street.
Thank you. You have made your statement very clearly. You will leave the papers here, and remember the advice which I have given you. Let the whole incident be a sealed book, and do not allow it to affect your life.
You're very kind, Mr. Holmes, but I cannot do that. I shall be true to Hosmer. He shall find me ready when he comes back.
For all the preposterous
hat and the vacuous face, there was something noble and simple faith of our visitor which compelled our respect. She laid a little bundle of papers upon the table and went her way, with a promise to come again whenever she might be summoned. Sherlock Holmes sat silent for a few minutes with his fingertips still pressed together, his legs stretched out in front of him, and his gaze directed upward to the ceiling. Then he took down from the rack the old and oily clay pipe, which was to him as a consoler, and having lit it, he leaned back in his chair, with a thick blue cloud wreath spinning up from him, and a look of infinite languor in his face. "Quite an interesting study, that maiden," he observed. "I found her more interesting than her little problem, which, by the way, is rather a trite one. You will find parallel cases if you consult my index in Andover in '77, and there was something of the sort in The Hague last year. Old as the idea, however, there were one or two details which were new to me, but the maiden herself was most instructive." "You appeared to read a good deal upon her, which was quite invisible to me," I remarked. "Not invisible, but unnoticed, Watson. You did not know where to look, so you missed all that was important. I can never bring you to realize the importance of sleeves, the suggestiveness of thumbnails, or the great issues which may hang from a bootlace. Now, what did you gather from the woman's appearance? Describe it." "Well, she had a slate-colored, broad-brimmed straw hat with a feather of a brickish red. Her jacket was black, with black beads sewn upon it, and the fringe of little black jet ornaments. Her dress was brown, rather darker than a coffee color, with a little purple plush about the neck and sleeves. Her gloves were grayish and were worn through at the right forefinger. Her boots I didn't observe. She had a small, round, hanging gold earring, and a general air of being fairly well-to-do, in a vulgar, comfortable, easy-going way." Sherlock Holmes clapped his hands together and chuckled. "'Pon my word, Watson, you're coming along wonderfully. You have really done well indeed. It is true that you have missed everything of importance, but you have hit upon the method, and you have a quick eye for color. Never trust the general impressions, my boy, but concentrate yourself upon details. My first glance is always look at a woman's sleeve. In a man it is better to first take on the knee of the trousers. As you observe, this woman had plush upon her sleeves, which is the most useful material for showing traces. A double line a little above the wrist, where the typewriter presses against the table, was beautifully defined. The sewing machine of the left hand leaves a similar mark, but only on the left arm, and on the side of the farthest from the thumb, instead of being right across the broadest part, as this was. I then glanced at her face, and observed the dent of a pince-nez at either side of her nose. I ventured to remark upon short sight and typewriting, which seemed to surprise her. She wore reading glasses. It surprised me, but surely it was obvious. I was then much surprised and interested on glancing down to observe that, though the boots which she was wearing were not unlike each other, they were really odd ones, the one having a slightly discolored toe cap, and the other having a plain one. One was buttoned only in the two lower buttons of the 5, and the other at first, third, and fifth. Now, when you see that a young lady, otherwise neatly dressed, has come away from her home in odd boots, but half-toned, it is no great deduction to say that she came away in a hurry. "And what else?" I asked, keenly interested, as I always was by my friend's incisive reasoning. I noted, in passing, that she had written a note before leaving home, but after being fully dressed. You observed that her right glove was torn at the forefinger, but you did not apparently see that both
glove, and finger were stained with violet ink. She had written in a hurry and dipped her pen in too deep, and must have been this morning, and the mark would not remain upon her finger. All this is amazing, though rather elementary, but I must get back to business, Watson. Would you mind reading me the advertised description of Mr. Hosmer Angel? I held up the printed slip to the light. Missing, it said, on the morning of the 14th, a gentleman named Hosmer Angel, about 5 feet 7 inches in height, strongly built, sallow complexion, black hair, and a little bald in the center, bushy black side whiskers, and mustache, tinted glasses, slight infirmity of speech, was dressed with the last scene, in a black frock coat faced with silk, black waistcoat, a gold Albert chain, and grey hairs tweed trousers with brown gaiters over, less excited boots, known to have been employed in the office of Leadenhall Street. Anybody bringing... Now that will do, what? Said Holmes. As to the letters, he continued, glancing over them, they are very commonplace, absolutely no clue in them to Mr. Angel, save that he quotes Balzac once. There is one remarkable point, however, that you will no doubt strike you. They are typewritten, I remarked. Not only that, but the signature is typewritten. Look at the neat little Hosmer Angel at the bottom. Then the date. You see, there's no superscript except Leadenhall Street, which is rather vague. The point about his signature is very suggestive. In fact, we may call it conclusive. Of what? My dear fellow, is it possible you do not see how strongly it bears the resemblance case? I cannot say that I do, unless it were that he wishes to be able to deny his signature if an action were bred and the promise were instituted. No, that was not the point. However, I will write 2 letters, which should settle the matter. One is to a firm in the city, the other is to a young lady's stepfather, Mr. Windibank, asking him whether he would meet us here at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. It is just as well that we should do business with the male relatives. And now, Doctor, we can do nothing until the answers to those letters come, so we may put our little problem upon the shelf for the interim. I had had so many reasons to believe in my friend's subtle powers of reasoning and extraordinary energy in action, that I felt that he must have some solid grounds for the assured and easy demeanor with which he treated the singular mystery, which he had been called upon to fathom. Only once had I known him to fail, in the case of the King of Bohemia and the Irene Adler photograph. But when I looked back to the weird business of the sign of 4, and the extraordinary circumstances connected with his study in scarlet, I felt that it would be a strange tangle indeed which he could not unravel. I left him then, still puffing at his black clay pipe, with the conviction that, when I came again the next evening, I would find that he held in his hands all the clues which would lead up to the identity of the disappearing bridegroom of Miss Mary Sutherland. A professional case of great gravity was engaging my own attention at the time, and the whole of the next day I was busy at the bedside of a sufferer. It was not until close upon 6 o'clock that I found myself free and was able to spring into the hansom and drive to Baker Street, half afraid that I might be too late to assist in the denouement of this little mystery. I found Sherlock Holmes alone, however, half asleep, with his long, thin form curled up in the recess of an armchair. A formidable array of bottles and test tubes, with the pungent clarity smell of hydrochloric acid, which told me that he had spent his day in the chemical work which was so dear to him. "Have you solved it?" asked, as I entered. "Yes, it is bisulfate of batia." No, the mystery," I cried. "Oh, that. I thought of the salt that I had been working upon. There was never any mystery on the matter, though. As I said yesterday, Some of the details are of interest. The only drawback is that there is no law, I fear, that can touch the scoundrel.
Who was he, then? What was his object in starting Miss Sutherland? The question was hard out of my mouth, and Holmes had not yet opened his lips to reply when we heard a heavy footfall in the passage and a tap at the door.
This is the girl's stepfather, Mr. James Windibank, said Holmes. He has written to me to say that he would be here at 6. Come in!
The man who entered was sturdy, middle-sized fellow, some 30 years of age, clean-shaven, and sallow-skinned, with a bland, insinuating manner, and a pair of wonderfully sharp and penetrating grey eyes. He shot a questioning glance at each of us, placed his shiny top hat upon his sideboard, and with a slight bow sidled down to the nearest chair.
Good evening, Mr. James Windibank, said Holmes. I think that this typewritten letter is from you, of which you made an appointment with me at 6 o'clock. Yes, sir. I'm afraid that I am a little late, but I am not quite my own master, you know. I am sorry that Miss Sutherland had troubled you about this little matter, for I think that it is far better to wash the linen of this sort of public. It was quite against my wishes that she came, but she is a very excitable, impulsive girl, and you may have noticed, and she is not easily controlled when she has made up her mind on a point. Of course, I did not mind you so much, as you are not connected to the official police, but it is not pleasant to have a family misfortune like this nosed abroad. Besides, it is useless expense, for how could you possibly find this Hosmer Angel? On the contrary, said Holmes quietly, I have every reason to believe that I will succeed in discovering Mr. Hosmer Angel.
Mr. Windibank gave a violent start and dropped his gloves.
I am delighted to hear it, he said. It is a curious thing, remarked Holmes, that the typewriter has been quite an individuality as a man's handwriting. Unless they are quite new, no two of them write exactly alike. Some letters get more worn than others, and some wear only on one side. Now, you remark on this note of yours, Mr. Windibank, that in every case there is some little slurring over the E, and a slight defect over the trail of the R. There are 14 other characteristics, but those are more obvious. We do our correspondence with this machine at the office, and no doubt it is a little worn. Our visitor answered, glancing keenly at Holmes with his bright little eyes. And now I will show you what is really very interesting study, Mr. Windibank, Holmes continued. I think of writing another little monograph some of these days on the typewriter and its relation to crime. It is a subject to which I have devoted some little attention. I have here 4 letters which purport to come from the missing man. They are all typewritten, and in each case not only are the E's slurred and the R tailless, but you will observe, if you care to use my magnifying glass, that the 14 other characteristics to which I have alluded are there as well. Mr. Windibank sprang out of his chair and picked up his hat. I cannot waste time over the sort of fantastic talk, Mr. Holmes, he said. If you can catch a man, catch him, and let him know that you have done it. Certainly, said Holmes, stepping over and turning the key in the door. I'll let you know, then, that I have caught him. What? Where? Shouted Mr. Windibank, turning white in his lips and glancing about the room like a rat in a trap. Oh, it won't do. It really won't, said Holmes suavely. There is no possible getting out of it, Mr. Windibank. It is quite too transparent, and it was very bad compliment when you said that it was impossible for me to solve so simple a question. That's right. Sit down and let us talk it over. Our visitor collapsed into the chair, with his ghastly face and glitter of moisture on his brow. It's not actionable, he stammered. I am much afraid that it is not, But between ourselves, Mr. Windibank, it was as cruel and selfish and heartless trick in a petty way as ever came before me. Now let me run over the course of events, and you will contradict me if I go wrong." The man settled in the chair, with his head sunk upon his breast, like one who is utterly crushed. Holmes stuck his feet up in a corner of the mantelpiece, and, leaning back with his hands in his pockets, began talking, rather to himself, as it seemed, than to us. The man married a woman very much older than himself for her money, he said, and he enjoyed the use of the money of the daughter for as long as she lived with them. It was a considerable sum for people in their position, for the loss of it would have made a serious difference. It was worth an effort to preserve it. The daughter was of good, amiable disposition, but affectionate and warm-hearted in her ways, and that it was evident with her fair personal advantages and her little income she would not have allowed to remain single long. But her marriage would mean, of course, the loss of 100 a year. So what does her stepfather do to prevent it? He takes the obvious course of keeping her at home and forbidding her to seek company of people of her own age. But soon he found that he would not answer forever. She became restive, insisting upon her own rights, and finally announced her positive intention of going to a certain ball. What does her clever stepfather do then? He conceives an idea more credible to his head than to his heart. With the connivance and assistance of his wife, he disguised himself, covered those keen eyes with tinted glasses, masked the face with a mustache and a pair of bushy whiskers, sunk with a clear voice into the insinuating whisper, and, doubtless secure on account of the girl's short sight, he appears as Mr. Hosmer Angel, and keeps off other lovers by making love himself. "It was only a joke at first," groaned our visitor. "We never thought she would have been so carried away." "Very likely not. However that may be, the young lady was very decidedly carried away, and having quite made up her mind that her stepfather was in France, and suspicion of treachery never for an instant entered her mind. She was flattered by a gentleman's attentions, and the effect was increased by a loudly expressed admiration of her mother. Then Mr. Angel began to call, for it was obvious that the matter should be pushed as far as it would go for a real effect were to be produced. There were meetings and an engagement which would finally secure the girl's affection from turning towards anyone else. But the deception could not be kept up forever. These pretended journeys to France were neither cumbrous. The thing to do was clearly to bring the business to an end in such a dramatic manner that it would leave a permanent impression upon the young lady's mind and prevent her from looking upon any other suitor for some time to come. Hence those vows of fidelity extracted upon a testament. And hence also the illusions of possibility of something happening on the very morning of the wedding. James Windibank wished Miss Sutherland to be so bound to Hosmer Angel, and so uncertain as to his fate, that for 10 years to come, at any rate, she would not listen to another man. As far as the church door brought her, and then, as he could go no further, he conveniently vanished away from the old trick of stepping out one door of the four-wheeler and out the other. I think that the chain of events, Mr. Windibank. Our visitor discovered something of the assurance while Holmes had been talking, and he rose to his chair now with a cold stare upon his face. "It may be so, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but if you are not very sharp, you ought to be sharp enough to know that it is you who are breaking the last now. Well, now, not me. I have done nothing actionable from the first, but as long as you keep that door locked, you lay yourself upon an action of assault and illegal constraint." "The law cannot, as I say, touch you," said Holmes, unlocking the door and throwing it open.
Yet there never was a man who deserved punishment more. If the young lady has a brother or friend, he ought to lay a whip across your shoulders, by Jove. He continued, flushing. It is not part of my duties to my clients, but here's a riding crop handy, and I think I shall treat myself to. It took 2 swift steps to the whip, but before he could grasp it in the wild chatter of steps up down the stairs, the heavy hall door banged, and from the window we could see Mr. James Windibank running at top speed down the road. There's a cold-blooded scoundrel, said Holmes, laughing, and he threw himself into his chair on the moor. That fellow will rise from crime to crime until he does nothing very bad at the end of the gallows. The case has, in some respects, not been entirely devoid of interest. I cannot now entirely see all the steps for your reasoning, I remarked. Well, of course it is obvious from the first that this is Mr. Hosmer Angel must have some strong object for his serious conduct, and it is equally clear that the only man who really profited by the incident, as far as we could see, was the stepfather. Then the fact that the 2 men were never together, but that one always appeared when the other was away, was suggestive. So were the tinted glasses and the curious face, which both hinted at a disguise, as did the bushy whiskers. My suspicions were all confirmed by this peculiar action of typewriting his signature, which, of course, inferred that his handwriting was so familiar to her that she would recognize even the smallest sample of it. You see, all these isolated facts, together with many minor ones, all pointed in the same direction. And how did you verify them? Having once spotted my man, it was easy to get corroboration. I knew the firm for which this man worked. Having taken the printed description, I eliminated everything from it which could be the result of a disguise. The whiskers, the glasses, the voice, and I sent it to the firm, with a request that they would inform me whether it traveled to the description of any of the travelers. I had already noticed the peculiarities of the typewriter, and had wrote the man himself at his business address, asking him if he would come here. As I expected, his reply was typewritten, and revealed the same trivial characteristic defects. The same post brought me a letter from Westmarch and Marbank, of Fenfreach Church, to say that the description tallied in every respect with that of their employee, James Windibank. Voilà toi! And Miss Sutherland? If I tell her, she will not believe me. You may remember the old Persian saying, there is danger for him who taketh a tiger cub, and danger also for whoever so snatches the delusion from a woman. There is such a sense in half as in the horse, and as much knowledge in the world. Did you see it? Did you know what was going on? I kinda got the idea. But that was elementary. And our next story The Boscombe Valley Mystery. We were seated at breakfast one morning, my wife and I, when the maid brought a telegram. It was from Sherlock Holmes, and ran in this way. Have you a couple of days to spare? We have just wired from west of England in connection to Boscombe Valley tragedy. Shall be glad if you will come with me. Air and scenery perfect. Leave Paddington by the 11:15. What do you say, dear? I said to my wife, looking across at me. Will you go? I really don't know what to say. I have a fairly long list at present. Throughs would look to your work for you. You have been looking a little pale lately. I think the change would be good for you, and you always are so interested in Mr. Sherlock Holmes's cases. I should be ungrateful if I were not, seeing what I have gained through them, I answered. But if I am to go, I must pack at once, for I only have half an hour. My experience at camp life in Afghanistan had at least the effect of making me a prompt and ready traveler. My wants were few and simple, so that in less than the time I stated, I was in a cab on my valise, rattling away to Paddington Station. Sherlock Holmes was pacing up and down the platform, his tall, gaunt figure made even gaunter and taller by his long grey travelling cloak and close-fitting cloth cap. "It is very good to see you have come, Watson," said he. "It makes a considerable difference to me, having someone with whom I can thoroughly rely. Local aid is always either worthless or else biased. If you will keep the two corner seats, I shall get the tickets." We had the carriage to ourselves, save for an immense litter of papers which Holmes had brought with him. Among these were rummaged and read, with intervals of note-taking and meditation, until we were past reading. Then suddenly he rolled them up into a giant ball and tossed them up into the rack. "Have you heard anything of the case?" he asked. "Not a word. I have not seen a paper for some days." "The London press has not had very full accounts. I have just been looking through all the recent papers in order to master the particulars. It seems, from what I gather, to be one of the simple cases which are so extremely difficult." "That sounds paradoxical." "But it is profoundly true. Singularity is almost invariably a clue. Most featureless and commonplace is a crime, the more difficult it is to bring home. In this case, however, they have established a very serious case against the son of the murdered man." "Is it a murder, then?" "Well, it is conjectured to be so. I shall take nothing for granted until I have the opportunity of looking personally into it. I will explain the state of things to you, as far as I have been able to understand it, in a very few words. Boscombe Valley is a country district not very far from Ross in Herefordshire. The largest landed proprietor of that part is Mr. John Turner, who made his money in Australia and returned some years ago to the old country. One of the farms which he held, that of Heatherley, was let to Mr. Charles McCarthy, who was also an ex-Australian. The men had known each other in the colonies, so that it was not unnatural that when they came to settle they should do so near each other as possible. Turner was apparently the richer man, so McCarthy became his tenant, but still remained, it seems, upon terms of perfect equality, as they were frequently together. McCartney had one son, a lad of 18, and Turner had only one daughter of the same age, and neither of them had wives living. They appear to have avoided the society of the neighboring English families, and have led retired lives, though both McCartneys were fond of sport, and were frequently seen at the race meetings of the neighborhood. McCartney kept two servants, a man and a girl. Turner had a considerable household, some half-dozen at the least. That is as much as I believe have been able to gather from the families. Now, just for the facts. On June 3rd, that is, Monday last, McCartney left his house at Heatherley about 3 in the afternoon and walked down to the Boscombe Pool, which is a small lake formed by the spreading out of a stream which runs down the Boscombe Valley. He had been out with the serving man in the morning at Ross, and he had told the man that he must hurry. He had an appointment of importance to keep there at 3. From that appointment he never came back alive. From Heatherley farmhouse to the Boscombe Pool was a quarter of a mile, and 2 people saw him as he passed over this ground. One was an old woman whose name was not mentioned, and the other was William Crowder, a gamekeeper in the employ of Mr. Turner. Both these witnesses depose that Mr. McCarthy was walking alone. The gamekeeper adds that within a few minutes of his meeting Mr. McCarthy, past he had seen his son, Mr. James McCarthy, going the same way with a gun under his arm. To the best of his belief, the father was actually to sights at the time, and the son was following him. He thought no more of the matter until he heard the evening of the tragedy that had occurred. The two McCartneys were seen after the time when William Crowder, the gamekeeper, lost sight of them. The Boscombe pool is thickly wooded around, and just a fringe of grass and reeds around the edge. A girl of 14, Patience Moran, who was the daughter of the lodgekeeper of the Boscombe Valley estate, was in one of the woods picking flowers. She states that while she was there she saw, at the border of the wood, very close to the lake, Mr. McCarthy and his son, and that they appeared to be having a violent quarrel. She heard Mr. McCarthy, the elder, using very strong language to his son, and she saw the latter raise his hand as if to strike his father. She was so frightened by their violence that she ran away and told her mother, when she reached home, that she had left the two McCarthys quarreling near Boscombe Pool, and that she was afraid that they were going to fight. She had hardly said the words when young Mr. McCartney came running up to the lodge to say that he had found his father dead in the wood, and to ask for help of the lodgekeeper. He was much excited, without either his gun or his hat, and his right hand and sleeve were observed to be stained with fresh blood. On following him, they found the dead body stretched upon the grass beside the pool. The head had been beaten in by repeated blows of some heavy and blunt object. The injuries were such as might have well been inflicted by the butt end of his son's gun, which was found lying on the grass within a few paces of the body. Under these circumstances, the young man was immediately arrested, and a verdict of willful murder having been returned at the inquest on Tuesday, he was on Wednesday brought to the magistrates at Ross, who have referred the case to the next assizes. Those are the main facts of the case as they came out before the coroner and the police report.
"I can hardly imagine a more damning case," I remarked. "If ever circumstantial evidence pointed to a criminal, it does so here."
"Circumstantial evidence is a very tricky thing," answered Holmes thoughtfully. "It may be to point to one thing, but if you shift your point of view a little, you may find it pointing in an equally uncompromising manner to something entirely different. It must be confessed, however, that the case looks exceedingly grave against the young man, and it is very possible that he is indeed the culprit. There are several people in the neighborhood, however, and among them Miss Turner, the daughter of the neighboring landowner, who believe in his innocence, and who have retained Lestrade, whom you may recollect in the collection of the Study in Scarlet, to work out the case in his interest. Lestrade, being rather puzzled, has referred the case to me, and hints it is that two middle-aged gentlemen are flying westward at 50 miles an hour instead of quietly digesting their breakfast at home."
"I'm afraid," I said, "that the facts are so obvious that you find little credit to be gained out of this case."
"There's nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact," he answered, laughing. "Besides, we may chance to hit upon some other obvious facts which may have been by no means obvious to Mr. Lestrade. You know me too well to think that I am boasting when I say that I shall either confirm or destroy his theory by means which he is quite incapable of employing, or even of understanding. To take the first example in hand, I very clearly perceive that your bedroom, the window is upon the right-hand side, and yet question whether Mr. Lestrade would have noted even so self-evident a thing as that."
"How on earth?"
"My dear fellow, you know well. I know the military neatness which categorizes you. You shave every morning, and this season you shave by the sunlight, but since your shaving is less and less complete, as we get further back on the left side, until it becomes positively sloven as we get around the angle of the jaw. It is surely very clear that this side is less illuminated than the other. I cannot imagine a man of your habits looking at himself in equal light and being satisfied with such a result. The only quote this is a trivial matter of observation and interference. Therein lies my métier, and it is possible that it may be of some service in the investigations which lies before us. There are one or two minor points which were brought out in the inquest, and which are worth considering. What are they? It appears that this arrest did not take place at once, but after the return of the Heatherley farm. Upon the inspector and the constabulary informing him that he was prisoner, he remarked that he was not surprised to hear it, and that it was no more than his deserts. The observation of this had the natural effect of removing any trace of doubt which might have restrained the minds of the coroner's jury. "It was a confession?" I ejaculated. "No, for it was followed by a protestation and of innocence. Coming on top of such a damning series of events, it was a most suspicious remark." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "it is the brightest rift which I can present see in the clouds. However innocent he might be, he could not be such an absolute imbecile as to not see that the circumstances were very black against him. Had he appeared surprised at his own arrest, or feigned indignation, I should have looked upon it as highly suspicious, because such surprise or anger would not be natural under the circumstances, and yet might appear to be the best policy to a scheming man. His frank appearance of the situation marks him as either an innocent man, or else as a man of considerable self-restraint and firmness. As to his remark about his deserts, it was also not unnatural if you consider that he stood beside the dead body of his father, and that there is no doubt that he had that very day gone forgotten of his filial duty as to the bandy works about him. And even according to the little girl whose evidence is so important, to raise his hand as if to strike him, the self-reproach and contrition which are displayed in the remark appear to me to be the signs of a healthy mind rather than a guilty one. I shook my head. "Many men have hanged on far slatter evidence," I replied. "So they have, and many men have been wrongfully hanged." "What is the young man's own account of the matter?" "It is, I am afraid, not very encouraging to his supporters, though there are one or two points in it which are suggestive. You will find it here, and you may read it for yourself." He picked out from his bundle of copy in the local Herefordshire paper. Having turned down the sheets, he pointed to the paragraph in which the unfortunate young man had given his own statement of what had occurred. I settled myself down in the corner of the carriage to read it very carefully. It ran this way. "Mr. James McCarthy, the only son of the deceased, was then called and gave evidence as follows. I had been away from home for 3 days at Bristol, and had only just returned upon the morning of last Monday the 3rd. My father was absent from home at the time of my arrival, and I was informed by the maid that he was driven down to Ross with John Cobb, the groom. Shortly after my return, I heard the wheels of his trap in the yard, and, looking out of my window, I saw him get out and walk rapidly out of the yard, though I was not aware in which direction he was going. I took my gun and strolled out in the direction of the Boscombe pool, with the intention of visiting the rabbit warden, which is upon the other side. On my way I saw William Crowder, the gamekeeper, and, as he stated in his evidence, he was mistaken in thinking I was following my father. I had no idea that he was in front of me. When about 100 yards from the pool, I heard a cry of "Coe!" which was the usual signal between my father and myself. I then hurried forward and found him standing by the pool. He appeared to be much surprised at seeing me, and asked me rather roughly what I was doing there. A conversation ensued which had led to high words and almost to blows, for my father was a man with a very violent temper. Seeing that his passion was becoming ungovernable, I left him and returned towards Heatherley Farm. I had not gone more than 150 yards, however, when I heard the hideous outcry behind me, which caused me to run back. I found my father expiring upon the ground with his head entirely injured. I dropped my gun and held him in my arms, but he almost instantly expired. I knelt beside him for some minutes, and then made my way to Mr. Turner's lodgekeeper, his house being the nearest, to ask for assistance. I saw no one near my father when I returned, and I have no idea how he came to his injuries. He was not a popular man, being somewhat cold and forbidding in his manners, but he had, as far as I know, no active enemies. I know nothing further of the matter. The coroner: Did your father make any statement to you before he died? The witness: He mumbled a few words, but I could only catch an allusion to a rat. Coroner: What did you understand by that? Witness: I conveyed no meaning at the time. I thought that he was delirious. Coroner: What was the point in which you and your father had this quarrel? Witness: I should prefer not to answer. Coroner: I'm afraid that I must press it. Witness: If it is really impossible for me to tell you, I can assure you that it has nothing to do with the sad tragedy which followed. Coroner: That is for the court to decide. I need not point out to you that your refusal to answer will prejudice your case considerably in any future proceedings which may arise. Witness: I must still refuse. Coroner: I understand that the cry of "Cooey" was the common signal between you and your father. Witness: It was. Coroner: How is it, then, that he uttered before he saw you, and before he even knew you had returned from Bristol? Witness, with considerable confusion: I do not know. Adjournment: Did you see nothing which aroused your suspicion when you returned on hearing the cry and found your father fatally injured? Witness: Nothing definite. Coroner: What do you mean? Witness: I was so disturbed and excited as I rushed out into the open that I could think of nothing except my father, and yet I have a vague impression that as I ran forward something lay upon the ground to the left of me. It seemed to be something of grey in colour, a coat of some sort, or plaid perhaps. When I rose from my father, I looked around, but it was gone. Do you mean that it disappeared before you went to help? Yes, it was gone. You cannot say what it was? No, I had a feeling something was there. How far from the body? A dozen yards or so. And how far from the edge of the woods? About the same. Then it was removed while you were within a dozen yards of it. Yes, but with my back towards it. This concludes the examination of the witness. I see, said I as I glanced down the column, that the coroner's concluding remarks was rather severe upon young McCarthy. He calls attention, and with reason, to the discrepancy about his father having signalled to him before seeing him, also to his refusal to give details of the conversation with his father, and a singular account of his father's dying words. They are all, as his remarks, very much against the sun. Holmes laughed softly to himself and stretched himself out upon the cushioned seat. Both you and the coroner have been at some pains, said he, to single out the very strongest points in the young man's favour. Don't you see that you alternatively give him credit for having too much imagination and too little? Too little. If he could have not invented a sense of a quarrel which would give him the sympathy to the jury. Too much if he evolved from his own inner consciousness to anything so outre as laying reference to a rat. And the incidents of the vanishing cloth. No, sir, I shall approach this case from the point of view with which this young man says is true, and we shall see whether the hypothesis will lead us. And now here is my pocket Petrock, and not another word shall I say of this case until we are on the scene of action. We lunch in Swindon, and I shall see that we shall be there within 20 minutes. It was nearly 4 o'clock when we at last, after passing through the beautiful Stroud Valley and over the broad gleaming Severn, we found ourselves in the pretty little town of Ross. A lean, ferret-like man, furtive and sly-looking, was waiting for us upon the platform. In spite of the little light brown dust coat and leather leggings, which he wore in deference to the rustic surroundings, I had no difficulty in recognizing Lestrade from Scotland Yard. With him, we drove to the Hereford Arms, where a room had already been engaged for us. "I have ordered a carriage," said Lestrade, as we sat over the key. "I knew your energetic nature, and that you would not be happy until you had been to the scene of the crime." "It was very nice and complimentary of you," Holmes answered. "It is entirely a question of biometric pressure." Lestrade looked startled. "I did not quite follow," he said. "How is the glass? 29, I see. No wind, and not a cloud in the sky. I have a case full of cigarettes here, which needs smoking, and the sofa is very much superior to the usual country hotel abomination. I do not think that it is probable that I shall use the carriage tonight." Stroud laughed indulgently. "You have, no doubt, already formed your conclusions from the paper," he said. "The case is as plain as a pikestaff, and the more one goes into the plainer it becomes. Still, of course, one can't refuse a lady, and such a very positive one, too. She heard of you, and would have your opinions, though I repeatedly told her that there was nothing which you could do which I had not already done. Why, bless my soul, here's a carriage at the door." We had hardly spoken before there rushed into the room one of the most lovely young women that I have ever seen in my life. Her violet eyes shining, her lips parted, a pink flush upon her cheeks. All thought of her natural reserve, lost in her overpowering excitement and concern. "Oh, Mr. Sherlock Holmes!" she cried, glancing at one to the other, and finally, with a woman's quick intuition, fastening upon my companion. "I'm so glad that you've come. I've driven down to tell you. I know James didn't do it. I know it. I want you to start upon your work, knowing it too. Never let yourself doubt that upon the point. We have known each other since we were little children, and I know his faults, and like no one does. He is too tender-hearted to hurt a fly. Such a charge is absurd to anyone who really knows him." "I hope we can clear him, Miss Turner," said Sherlock Holmes. "We may rely upon my doing all that I can." "But you read through the evidence. You formed a conclusion. Do you not see some loophole, some flaw? Do you not yourself think he is innocent?" "I think that is very probable." "There now," she cried, throwing back her head and looking defiantly at Lestrade. "You hear? He gives me hopes." Lestrade shrugged his shoulders. "I'm afraid that my colleague has been a little quick in forming his conclusions," he said. "But he is right. Oh, I know that he is right. James never did. And about his quarrel with his father, I'm sure that the reason he would not speak of it is about the coroner was because I was concerned in it." "In what way?" asked Holmes. "It is no time for me to hide anything. James and his father had many disagreements about me. Mr. McCarthy was very anxious that there would be a marriage between us. James and I had always loved each other so much as brother and sister, but of course he is young and has very little of life yet, and he naturally did not wish anything like that yet. So there were quarrels, and this, I'm sure, was one of them." "And your father?" asked Holmes. "Was he in favor of this union?" "No, he was averse to it also. No one but Mr. McCarthy was in favor of it.
A quick blush passed over her fresh young face as Holmes shot her one of his keen, questioning glances at her. "Thank you for this information," he said. "May I see your father if I call tomorrow?"
I'm afraid the doctor won't allow it.
"The doctor?"
Yes, have you not heard? Poor father has never been strong in years back, and it has broken him down completely. He was taken to his bed by Dr. Willows. Says he's a wreck, and that his nervous system is shattered. Mr. McCarthy was the only man alive who had known Dad in his old days in Victoria.
"Ha, Victoria, that is important."
Yes, the mines.
"Quite so, at the gold mines, where, as I understand, Mr. Turner made his money?"
Yes, certainly.
"Thank you, Miss Turner. You have been of material assistance to me."
You'll tell me if you have any news tomorrow. No doubt you will go to the prison to see James. Oh, if you do, Mr. Holmes, do tell him that I know him to be innocent.
"I will, Miss Turner."
I must go home now, for Dad is ill, and he misses me if I leave him. Goodbye, and God help you in your undertaking.
She hurried from the room as impulsively as if she had entered, and we heard the wheels of her carriage rattle off down the street. "I'm ashamed of you, Holmes," said Lestrade with dignity after a few minutes' silence. "Why should you raise the hopes of which you are bound to disappoint? I'm not over tender at heart, but I call it cruel." "Yes, but only for you and me." "Then I shall reconsider my resolution about going out. We have still time to take the train to Hereford and see him tonight." "Ample?" "Then let us do it, Watson. I fear that you will find it very slow, but I shall only be away a couple of hours." I walked down to the station with them, and then wandered through the streets of the little town, finally returning to the hotel, where I lay upon the sofa and tried to interest myself in a yellow-backed novel. The punny plot of the story was so thin, however, when compared to the deep mysteries through which we were groping, and I found my attention wander rather continually from the fiction to fact, that I last flung it across the room and gave myself up entirely to the consideration of the events of the day. Supposing that this unhappy young man's story were absolutely true, then what hellish thing, what absolutely unforeseen and extraordinary calamity, could have occurred between the time when he parted from his father and the moment when, drawn back to his screams, he rushed into the glade? It was something terrible and deadly. What could it be? Might not the nature of the injuries reveal something in my medical instincts? I rang a bell and called for the weekly county paper, which contained a verbatim account of the inquest. In the surgeon's disposition it was stated that the posterior left of the third partial bone and the left half of the occipital bone had been shattered by a heavy blow from a blunt object. I marked the spot upon my head. Surely such a blow would have been struck from behind. That was to some extent in favor of the accused, as when seen quarreling he was face to face with his father. Still, it did not go for very much, for the older man might have turned his back before the blow fell. Still, it might be worth while to call Holmes's attention to it. Then there was a peculiar dying reference to a rat. What could that mean? It could not be delirium. A man dying from a sudden blow does not have commonly become delirious. No, it was more likely to be an attempt to explain how he met his fate. But what could it indicate? I cudgelled my brains to find some possible explanation, and then the incident of the grey cloth seen by young McCarthy. If that were true, the murderer must have dropped some part of his dress, presumably his overcoat, in his flight, and must have had the hardihood to return, and to carry it away in some instant when the sun was kneeling his back, turned not a dozen paces away. What tissue of mysteries and improbabilities the whole thing was! I did not wonder at Lestrade's opinion, and yet I had so much faith in Sherlock Holmes's insight that I could not lose hope as long as a very fresh fact seems to strengthen the conviction of young McCarthy's innocence. It was late before Holmes returned. He came back alone, for Lestrade was staying in lodgings in this town. "The glass keeps very high," he remarked in his sat-down. "It is of importance that it should not rain before we are able to go round the ground. On the other hand, a man should be at his very best and keenest for such nice work as that, and I did not wish to do it when fagged by a long journey. I have seen young McCarthy." "And what did you learn from him?" "Nothing." Could he throw no light?" "None at all. I was inclined to think that at one time he knew who had done it and screened him or her, but I am convinced now that he is puzzled, as everyone else. He is not a very quick-witted youth, though comely to look at, and, I should think, sound at heart." "I cannot admire his taste," I remarked. "If it is indeed a fact that he was adverse to marriage with so charming a young lady as Miss Turner." "Thereby hangs a rather painful tale. This fellow was madly, insanely in love with her. But some 2 years ago, when he was only a lad, and before he really knew her, she had been away for 5 years at a boarding school. What does the idiot do but get in the clutches of a barmaid in Bristol and marry her at a registry office? No one knows a word of the matter, but you can imagine how maddening it must be for him to be upbraided for not doing what he would give his very eyes to do, but what he knows to be absolutely impossible. It was sheer frenzy of this sort that made him throw his hands suggested into the air when his father, at their last interview, was goading him on to propose to Miss Turner. On the other hand, he had no means of supporting himself, and his father, who was by all accounts a very hard man, would have thrown him over utterly had he known the truth. It was his barmaid wife that had spent the last 3 days in Bristol, and his father did not know where he was. Mark that point. It is of importance. Good has come out of evil, however, for the barmaid, finding from the papers that he is in serious trouble, and likely to be hanged, has thrown him utterly over, and has written him to say that she has a husband already in Bermuda Dockyard, so that there is really no tie between them. I think that bit of news consoles young McCarthy for all that he has suffered."
"But if he is innocent, who has done it?"
"Ah! Who? I would call your attention particularly to 2 points. One is that the murdered man who had an appointment with someone at the pool, and that the someone could not have been his son, for his son was away, and he did not know when he would return. The second is that the murdered man was heard to cry 'Qui!' before he knew that his son had returned. Those are crucial points upon which the case depends, and let us talk about George Meredith, if you please, and we shall leave all minor matters until tomorrow."
There was no rain, as Holmes had foretold, and the morning broke bright and cloudless. At 9 o'clock Lestrade called for us into the carriage, and we set off for Heatherley Farm and the Boscombe pool.
"There is serious news this morning," Lestrade observed. "It is that Turner of the Hall is so ill that his life is despaired of."
"An elderly man, I presume?" said Holmes.
"About 60, but his constitution has been shattered by his life abroad, and he has been in failing health for some time. This business has been a very bad effect upon him. He was an old friend of McCarthy's, and, I may add, a great benefactor to him, for I have learned that he gave him Heatherley Farm rent-free."
"Indeed, that is interesting," said Holmes.
"Oh, yes. In 100 other ways he has helped him. Everybody about here speaks of his kindness to him."
"Really?
Does it not strike you as a little singular that this McCarthy, who appears to have had little of his own, has been under such obligations to Turner, should still talk of marrying his son to Turner's daughter, who is presumably the heiress of the state, and that in such a very cocksure manner, as if it were merely a case of proposal, and all else would follow. It is the more strange, since we know that Turner himself was adverse to the idea. The daughter told us as much. Do you not deduce something from that? I've got to the conclusions and inferences, said Lestrade, winking at me. I find it hard enough to tackle facts, Holmes, without flying after the theories and fancies. You're right, said Holmes demurely. You do find it rather hard to tackle the facts. Anyhow, I've grasped one fact that you seem to find it difficult to get a hold of, replied Lestrade with some warmth. And that is? That McCarthy Senior met his death from McCarthy Jr., and that all theories to the contrary are the merest moonshine. Well, moonshine is a brighter thing than fog, said Holmes, laughing. But I am very much mistaken if this is not Heatherley Farm upon the left. That it is. It was a widespread, comfortable-looking building, 2-storied, flat-roofed, with the great yellow blotches of lichen upon the grey walls. The drawn blinds and the smokeless chimneys, however, gave it a stricken look, as though the weight of all this horror still lay heavy upon it. We called at the door, when the maid, at Holmes' request, showed us the boots which the master wore at the time of his death, and also a pair of his sons, though not the pair which he had on then. Having measured these very carefully from 7 to 8 different points, Holmes desired to be led to the courtyard, from which we all followed the winding track which led to Boscombe Pool. Sherlock Holmes was transformed when he got hot upon such a scent as this. Men who had only known quiet thinker and logician of Baker Street would have failed to recognize him. His face flushed and darkened, his brows were drawn into 2 hard black lines, while his eyes shone from underneath them with a steely glinter. His face was bent downwards, his shoulders bowed, his lips compressed, and the veins stood out like whipcord on his long, sinewy neck. His nostrils seemed to dilate with purely animal lust for the chase, and his mind was so absolutely concentrated upon the matter before him that a question or remark fell unheeded upon his ears, or, at the most, only provoked a quick, impatient snarl in reply. Swiftly and silently he made his way along the track which ran through the meadows, and so by way of the woods to Boscombe Pool. It was damp, marshy ground, as is all in that district, and there were marks of many feet, both upon the path and amid the short grass which bounded it on either side. Sometimes Holmes would hurry on, sometimes stop dead. At once he made a quite little detour into the meadow. Lestrade and I walked behind him, but the detective indifferent and contemptuous, while I watched my friend in the interest which sprang from the conviction that every one of his actions was directed towards a definite pool. The Boscombe Pool, which was a little red reed-girt sheet of water about 50 yards across, was situated at the boundary between the Heatherley Farm and the private park of the wealthy Mr. Turner. Above the woods which lined it, upon the farther side, we could see the red jutting pinnacles which marked the side of the rich landowner's dwelling. On the Heatherley side of the pool, the woods grew very thick, and there was a narrow belt of sodden grass 20 paces across either the edge of the trees and the reeds which lined the lake. Lestrade showed us the exact spot where the body had been found, and indeed, so moist was the ground that I could plainly see the traces which had been left by the fall of the stricken man. To Holmes, as I could see by his eager face and peering eyes, very many things were to be read upon the trampled grass. He ran around like a dog who was picking up a scent, and then turned upon my companion. "What did you go into the pool for?" he asked. "I fished about with the rake. I thought there might be some weapon or other trace. But how on earth—" "Oh, tut-tut, I have no time. The left foot of yours with the inward twist is all over the place. A mole could trace it, and there it vanishes among the reeds. Oh, how simple it would have been had I been here before that came like a herd of buffalo and wallowed all over it. Here's where the party with the lodgekeeper came, and there have covered all the tracks of 6 or 8 feet around the body. But here are 3 separate tracks of the same feet. He drew out a lens that lay upon his waterproof to have a better view, taking all the time to get rather to himself than to us. These are young Mr. Cathy's feet. Twice he was walking, and once he ran swiftly, so that the soles are deeply marked and the heels hardly visible. That bears out his story. He ran when he saw his father on the ground. Then here is his father's feet as he paced up and down. What is this, then? It is the button of the gun as soon as his son stood listening. And this? Ha-ha! What have we here? Tiptoes! Tiptoed square, too, and quite unusual boots. They come, they go, they come again, and of course that was from the cloak. Now where did they come from? He ran up and down, sometimes losing, sometimes finding the track until we were well within the edge of the wood, and under the shadow of a great beech, the largest tree in the neighborhood. Holmes traced his way to the farther side, and lay down once more upon his face, with a little cry of satisfaction. For a long time he remained there, turning over the leaves, the dried sticks, gathering up what seemed to be a bit of dust into an envelope, and examining his lens not only the ground, but even the bark of the trees so far as he could reach. A jagged stone was lying among the moss, and this he also carefully examined. But then he followed the pathway of the wood until he came to high road, where all traces were lost. "It has been a case of considerable interest," he remarked, returning to his usual manner. "I fancy that this grey house on the right must be the lodge. I think that I will go in and have a word with Moran, and perhaps write a little note. Having done that, we may drive back to our luncheon. They may walk to the cab, and I shall be with you presently." It was about 10 minutes before we ran our cab and drove back to the Ross. Holmes was carrying with him the stone which he had picked up with the woods. "This may be of interest to you, Lestrade," he remarked, nodding it out. "The murder was done with this." "I see no marks." "There are none." "Then how do you, then?" "The grass was growing under it. It had only lain there a few days. There was no sign of a place whence it had been taken. It corresponds with the injuries, and there is no sign of any other weapon." "And the murderer?" "Is a tall man, left-handed, limps with a right leg, wears a thick-soled shooting boots, and had a grey cloak, smokes Indian cigars, uses a cigar holder, and carries a blunt penknife with his pocket. There are several other indications, but these may be enough to aid us in our search." Lestrade laughed. "I'm afraid that I'm still a skeptic," he said. "Theories are all very well, but we have to deal with a hard-boiled British jury." "Nos verons," answered Holmes calmly. "You'll work your own method, and I shall work mine. I shall be busy this afternoon, and shall probably return to London by the evening train." "And leave your case unfinished?" "No, finished." "But the mystery?" "It is solved." "Who is the criminal, then?" "The gentleman I described." "But who is he?" Surely it would not be difficult to find out. This is such a populous neighborhood. Lestrade shrugged his shoulders. I am a practical man, he said. I cannot undertake to go about the country looking for a left-handed gentleman with a game leg. I should become a laughing-stock of Scotland Yard, if you weren't already. All right, said Holmes quietly. I have given you the chance. Here by your lodgings. Goodbye. I shall drop you a line before I leave. Having left Lestrade at his rooms, we drove to our hotel, where we found lunch upon the table. Holmes was silent and buried in thought, with a pained expression upon his face, as one who finds himself in a perplexing position. Look here, Watson, he said when his glass was cleared. Just sit down in this chair, and let me preach to you for a little. I don't know quite what to do, and I should value your advice. Light a cigar, and I shall expound. Pray do so. Well now, in considering the case, there are 2 points about young Mr. McCarthy's narrative which struck me both instantly, although they impressed me in his favor and you against him. One was the fact that his father, according to his account, cried "cooey" before seeing him, other than the singular dying reference to a rat. He mumbled several words, you understand, but that was all that caught his son's ear. Now, from his double point, our research must commence, and we will begin it by presuming that what the lad says is absolutely true. What of the gooey, then? Well, obviously it could not have been meant for his son. The son, as far as he knew, was in Bristol. It was a mere chance that he was within earshot. The cooey was meant to attract the attention of whoever it was he had the appointment with. But cooey is distinctly Australian cry, and one which is used between Australians. There is a strong presumption that the person whom Mr. McCarthy expected to meet with at Boscombe Pool was someone who had been in Australia. What of the rat, then? Sherlock Holmes took a folded paper from his pocket and flattened it on the table. This is a map of the colony of Victoria, he said. I wired to Bristol for it last night. He put his hand over part of the map. What do you read? A rat, I read. And now, he raises his hand. Ballarat. Quite so. That is the word the man uttered, and which his son only caught the last 2 syllables. He was trying to utter the name of his murderer, so-and-so of Ballarat. It is wonderful, I exclaimed. It is obvious, and now you see, I had narrowed the field down considerably. The possession of a grey garment was the 3rd point, which, granted his son's statements to be correct, was a certainty. We have come now to the mere vagueness of the definite conception of an Australian from Ballarat with a grey cloak. A grey rat. Certainly. And one who has at home in the distance for the pool can only be approached by the farm or by the estate, where strangers would hardly wonder. Quite so. Then it comes our expedition of today. By the examination of the ground, I gained a trifling details which I give the imbecile Lestrade to the personality of the criminal. But how did you gain them? You know my method. It is founded upon the observation of trifles. It's hard to know that you might roughly judge from the length of his stride. His boots, too, might be told from the traces. Yes, and they were peculiar boots. But his lameness? The impression of his right foot was always been distinct than his left. He put less weight upon it. Why? Because he limped. He was lame. But his left-handedness? You were yourself struck by the nature of the injury, as recorded by the surgeon in the inquest. The blow was struck from immediately behind, and yet was upon the left side. Now, how can that be unless you are a left-handed man? He stood behind a tree during the interview between the father and son. He had even smoked there. I found the ash of a cigar, which my knowledge of tobacco ashes symbols to pronounce it to be an Indian cigar. I have, as you know, devoted some attention to this, and have written a little monograph of the ashes of 140 different variants of pipe, cigar, and cigarette tobacco. Having found the ash, then I looked around and discovered the stump among the moss where he had tossed it. It was an Indian cigar of the variety which is rolled in Rotterdam. And the cigar holder? I could see that the end had not been in his mouth before he had used the holder. The tip had been cut off, not bitten off. But the cut was not a clean one, so I deduced a blunt penknife. "Holmes," I said, "you have drawn a net around the man from which he cannot escape." Maybe. "And you have saved an innocent human life as truly as if you had cut the cord by which he was hanging him. I see the direction in which this points. The culprit is—" "Mr. John Turner," cried the hotel waiter, opening the door of our sitting room and ushering in a visitor. Pyongyang raid. The man who entered was a strange and impassive figure. His slow, limping step and bowed shoulders gave the appearance of decrepitude, and yet his hard, deepened, craggy features and his enormous limbs showed that he was possessed of unusual strength of body and of character. His tangled beard, grizzled hair, and outstanding, drooping eyebrows combined to give an air of dignity and power to his appearance. But his face was of ashen white, while his lips and the corners of his nostrils were tinged with a shade of blue. It was clear to me at the glance that he was the drip of some deadly and chronic disease. "Pray sit down on the sofa," said Holmes gently. "You had my note." "Yes, the lodge-keeper brought it up. You said that you had wished to see me here to avoid scandal." "I thought people would talk if I were in the hall." "And why did you wish to see me?" He looked across at my companion with despair in his weary eyes, as though his questions were already answered. "Yes," said Holmes, answering the look rather with words. "It is so. I know all about McCarthy." The old man sank his face into his hands. "God help me," he cried. "But I would not have yet let the young man come to harm. I give you my word that I would have spoken out if it weren't against all the Aussies." "I am glad to hear you say so," said Holmes gravely. "I would have spoken now had it not been for my dear girl. It would break her heart. It would still break her heart if she hears that I am arrested." Pages stuck together. "It may not come to that," said Holmes. "What?" "I am no official agent. I understand that it is your daughter who required my presence here, and I am acting in her interests. Young McCarthy must be got off, however." "I am a dying man," said old Turner. "I have had diabetes for years. My doctor says it is a question whether I live a month, yet I would rather die under my own roof than in a jail." Holmes rose and sat down at the table with his pen in his hand and a bundle of paper before him. "Just tell the truth," he said. "I shall jot down the facts, you will sign it, and Watson here can witness it. Then I can produce your confession at the last extremity to save young McCarthy. I promise you that I shall not use it unless it is absolutely needed." "That's as well," said the old man. "It's a question whether I shall live in the Aussies or it matters little to me. But I should wish to spare Alice's shock. And now I will make the thing clear to you. It has been a long time in acting, but it will not take me long to tell." You didn't know this dead man, McCarthy. He was the devil incarnate, I tell you. God keep you out of the clutches of such a man as he. His grip has been upon me these 20 years, and he has blasted my life. I'll tell you first how I came to be in his power. It was in the early 60s at the diggings. I was a young chap then, hot-blooded and reckless, ready to turn my hand at anything. I got among bad companions and took to drink. Had no luck with my claim. Took to the bush. Word came that you could call over a highway robber. There were 6 of us, and we had a wild, free life of it. Sticking up at a station from time to time, or stopping the wagons on the road to diggings. Black Jack of Ballrat is the name I went under. And our party is still remembered in the colony as the Ballrat Gang. One day a gold convoy came into Ballrat to Melbourne, and we laid in wait for it and attacked it. There were 6 troopers and 6 of us. So it was a close thing, but we emptied 4 of their saddles at the first volley. 3 of our boys were killed, however, before we got the swag. I put my pistol to the head of the wagon driver, who was this very man McCarthy. I wished to the Lord that I had shot him then, but I spared him, though I saw his wicked little eyes fixed on my face, as though I remember every feature. We got away with the gold. We became wealthy, and we made our way over to England without being suspect. There I parted from my old pals and determined to settle down a little and live a quiet, respectable life. I bought the estate from which chanced to be in the time market, and I set myself to do a little good with the money and made up the way in which I had earned it. I married, too, and though my wife died young, she left me with my dear little Alice. Even when she was a little baby, just her wee hands seemed to lead me down the right path as nothing else had ever done. In a word, I turned over a new leaf and did my best to make up for my past. All was going well when McCarthy laid his grip upon me. I had gone up to town about an investment, and I met him in Regent Street with hardly a coat on his back and a boot in his foot. "Here we are, Jack," he says, touching me on the arm. "We'll be as good as family to you. There's 2 of us, me and my son, and you can have the keeping of us. If you don't, it's fine. A law-abiding county is England. But there's always a policeman within hand." Well, down they came to the West Country. There was no shaking them off, and there they have lived rent-free on my best piece of land. There was no rest for me, no peace, no forgetfulness. Turn where I would, there was his cunning, grinning face at my elbow. It grew worse as Alice grew up, for as soon as he saw I was afraid of her knowing my past and that of the police. Whatever he wanted he must have, and whatever it was I gave him without question. Money, land, houses, until at last he asked the thing that I could not give. He asked for Alice. His son, you see, had grown up, and so had my girl, and I was known to be in weak health. It seemed as a fine stroke for him to have his lad step into the whole property. But there I was firm. I would not have his cursed stock mixed with mine. Not that I had any dislike for the lad, but his blood was in him. And that was enough. I stood firm. McCarthy threatened. I braved him to do his worst. We were to meet at the pool midday between our homes and talk it over. When I went down there, I found him talking with his son, so I smoked a cigar and waited behind a tree until he should be gone. But as I listened to his talk, and all that was bad and bitter in me seemed to come up uppermost. He was urging his son to marry my daughter with as little regard for what she might think as if she were a slut from off the streets. It drove me to mad to think that and all I had most dear in my power was in such a man as this. Could I not stop Bond? I was already a dying and desperate man. Though clear of mind and fairly strong of limb, I knew that my fate was sealed. But my memory and my girl, both could be saved if I could but silence this foul tongue. I did it, Mr. Holmes. I would do it again. Deeply as I've sinned, I've led a life of martyrdom to atone for it. But that my girl should be entangled in the same meshes which held me was more than I could suffer. I struck him down with no more compunction than if I had been some foul and venomous beast. His cry brought back his son, but I gained the cover of the wood, though I was forced to go back and fetch my cloak, which I had dropped in my flight. That is a true story, gentlemen, of all that occurred. Well, it is not of me to judge you, said Holmes as his old man signed the statement, which was been drawn out. I pray that we may never be exposed to such temptation. I pray not, sir. And what do you intend to do? In view of your health, nothing. You are yourself aware that you will soon have to answer for your deed in a higher court than that of the Aussies. I will keep your confession, and if McCarthy is condemned, I shall be forced to use it. If not, it shall never be seen by mortal eye, and your secrets, whether you be alive or dead, shall be safe with us. Farewell, then, said the old man solemnly. Your own deathbeds, when they come, will be easier for the thought of the peace that you have given to mine. Tottering and shaking as the giant frame, he stumbled slowly from the room. God help us, said Holmes after a long silence. Why does fate play such tricks with poor, helpless worms? I never hear of such a case as this that I do not think of Baxter's words and say, There, but for the grace of God, go Sherlock Holmes. James McCarthy was acquitted by the Aussies as the strength of the number of objections which had been drawn out by Holmes and submitted to the defending counsel. Old Turner lived for 7 months after our interview, but now he is dead. And there is every prospect that the son and daughter may come live happily together in ignorance of the black cloud which rests upon their house. Oh. That speech was getting to me. Oh. I'm sorry I could stop and greet you properly, but middle of a confession. But thank you for the raid, Evie. Do a shout out because I can. If I can type with one hand, which I should be able to do by now. You think? Yep, there we go. Whew. I need to do a custom shout out for you since you come in so often. Ouch. Yeah. What story was that? I already forgot the title of it. That was the Boscombe Valley Mystery. But we have hit my usual 2-hour mark, and my voice is killing me now. Take my head off. Whoop. My headset won't come off. All items. Okay. Yeah. Anyway. Let's see who is on that we can raid. Let's see.
reading people have already gone off for the night, so let's see. Desk is on. We need to find someone. Let's see. Unless if you guys have any suggestions, which is always cool. Like everyone on my follow list is already hit for tonight. I wonder if there's anyone actually doing the story time right now. Or am I the only one who uses it? Nope, I'm the only one who uses story time apparently. Shoot. Anyone I know this? My audio is going crazy. I don't know if it's just through my computer doing it or what. But let's see. I really do have a hard time finding people to read. I don't know if I want to go off topic or go into something else. Or if I just want to close out for the night. It kind of goes all over the place, honestly. Ouch. Oh, since we do just have, oh, now down to 2 of us. I may just go ahead and call it for the night. So, I do thank you all for coming in. Thank you for the raid and such. And back to fairy tales tomorrow. So, I will hopefully see you then. And have a good night, everyone. Later.